Good morning, good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Derrynane House, to Cahir Daniel, to my mother's parish, if I can say it that way, and to this particular part of the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. Because we have an addition to our programme this morning, I'm going to get on with it. First of all, I'd like to give a special welcome to two very special guests this morning. Geraldine, the Countess of Dunraven, and Mr. Maurice Buckley, the Chairman of the Office of Public Works. Before introducing Geraldine, I'd like to just acknowledge, first of all, the presence here of the Chairperson of the Board of Works, Maurice Buckley. The relationship between the school and the Office of Public Works since day one has been very special. I was saying to Maurice last night how much we value the relationship between the school and the Office of Public Works, how very greatly they have supported the school from day one. You know, to have a summer school, even in a building like this, which is managed so efficiently by the Department of Public Works or the Office of Public Works over the years, is no small venture. It demands a lot of discommoding, it demands a lot of organisation, and we're very grateful to the people who work in this house and who work for the Office of Public Works for their support over the years in making this part of the O'Connell School such a success. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Chris O'Neill, who manages this part of the service for Public Works, which is why, actually, Chris, I asked you to stand up here, because I know you're a shy man, so now you know why you're there. And without further ado, because you know I can go on a bit, I'm going to introduce Maurice Buckley from the Office of Public Works to open this part of the proceedings this morning, after which the presentation will take place, after which Lady Dunraven will say a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Well, G. Gallair, and thank you for the opportunity. Oh, did I hit something? No, I didn't. Thank you for the opportunity to open the Derrynane leg of the this year's Daniel O'Connell Summer School. As the custodians of Derrynane Abbey House Gardens, on behalf of the Irish State, my OPW colleagues and I, we really want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you as guests and as visitors here to the property today. What is it about the name Maurice? I'm delighted to find all this association. I mean, there are umpteen Maurice O'Connells in the family, and the host is Maurice Brick and Maurice Buckley, head of the OPW. So I don't often get that, so that's great. There's something in the air. The OPW, the Office of Public Works, has many different roles, and depending on the audience, I find myself emphasising different aspects. So, for example, I might often highlight the architecture, the conservation work, or in another forum, it might be more about climate change resilience and the work we do on flood relief defences and so on in communities all across the country, including Adair. We were just talking about it earlier. Or perhaps it might be ecology and biodiversity in the parks and gardens for which the Office of Public Works is responsible, the National Botanic Gardens, the Phoenix Park, and here locally, not just the wonderful gardens here in Derrynane that are always developing, but also nearby in Garnish Island in Glengariff, again one of Chris's properties, which is absolutely beautiful. But I suppose most relevant today, and a very central role for the OPW in our heritage work, is certainly to bring to life our history through the presentation of national monuments and historic properties, like Derrynane, where we are today, and how appropriate it is then to have the privilege of hosting a historical focused summer school in the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. And the school, with its dedication to highlighting the legacy of Daniel O'Connell and those important issues that were important to him and that still are important in Irish society today. And I had the privilege of being with you yesterday when Seamus Mallon spoke, and that just struck me so strongly. Said how he was able to link the whole Daniel O'Connell approach to the Good Friday Agreement and things that are current today. So it is absolutely fabulous, and long may this association between Derrynane, the summer school, and the OPW continue. The OPW itself has a long history in Ireland, and it struck me in thinking about this event that Daniel O'Connell would have been 55 years of age and probably at the height of his power and influence back in 1831, when the Board of Works in Ireland was established by statute. So I wonder, did he express an opinion at the time about this event? Don't say it. What would he have thought about it? And what would he say if he was alive today and saw what had become of his ancestral home here at Derrynane? We know that he was a great advocate of the development of public infrastructure, roads, harbours, piers, railways. So I'd like to think that he would have been very supportive of the newborn OPW back in 1831, and that I hope he would be positive about the work that has been done since and the modern day incarnation of the Office of Public Works. If there is any historian or researcher here in the audience who is aware or has come across any reference to the Board of Works in the writings of O'Connell or writings from that time, we'd be very interested in hearing about that link so that we could add it to the history of the OPW as well. Now, while I have the floor for a few minutes, and such a learned audience, and perhaps picking up on Terry Dooley's talk yesterday on historical homes, that is a topic of great relevance to the OPW and Irish history, and I personally find fascinating the relationship that we have in Ireland to our great houses of the past. It was the renowned Irish historian and former professor of Irish history at Oxford, Roy Foster, who really brought this home to me. He was speaking last year at an event in Castletown House in Selbridge, and afterwards he said to me, "Maurice, you know, the treatment of the peasants by the landlord in an English town, landlord living in that great house up on the hill, was just as appalling, if not more appalling, than the treatment of the Irish tenants. The heavy taxes, the violence, the bad treatment of women, the poverty, all of these things we had. But in the UK, that great house on the hill is now treasured in the community, and it's seen as a symbol of a great past, proudly to a great past that they hope might someday come back. And I think that thinking maybe explains an awful lot about what's happening at the moment with Brexit and October the 31st and all of that. Whereas meanwhile in Ireland, the great house on the hill over here, we're conflicted, and we have been conflicted. So we have associated that big house on the hill primarily with our colonial history, with a history of occupation and oppression. But I do think we're living in a time now, 100 years after independence, when that is dramatically changing, and changing very quickly. More and more, and we see it in the OPW, visitor numbers are skyrocketing in all of our houses around the country, that people are appreciating houses much more for what they are, the beauty and elegance that's there, the beauty and elegance of the stately homes as something to be really valued. We're a bit away yet, though, from us all bequeathing a few €1,000 in our wills to those responsible for preserving the houses. That's what they do in the UK. The National Trust is funded like that. I better stop. That's just the chairman of the OPW getting carried away. Wishful thinking. But what about Derrynane House, though, in this context? Is it not different? Surely if our history of occupation gets in the way of us truly enjoying the historic built heritage, must Derrynane House not surely be the exception, because the house of the liberator, the emancipator, is that not the perfect history? Has that not got all what we want? Is that not a class apart and something that can be fully supported without reservation by the state and by the people? And I think it is. But just when I thought I'd found the perfect counter-example to the earlier points I was making, Olivia O'Leary comes along with the documentary, I think a very good documentary. It started during the week and the second part next week, and we were very happy to support it here in Derrynane during the filming. But she was making the point, a good point, that perhaps the O'Connell method, democracy, pacifism and so on, didn't sit well with the early generations of Irish political leaders who'd come from the rebellion period and who'd won bitter freedom, as Maurice Walsh called it in the title of his recent book. Another Maurice, by the way. So was there something there? So again, I'm curious about the topic and the relationship to Derrynane, and where better to throw out the question than at the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. Because there are people here in the audience who know more about these topics than I ever will, or we ever will. So we certainly, in the OPW, we're not aware of any reluctance for political reasons by the early leaders of the state when it came to taking on responsibility for managing the House. But maybe there was something. I mean, back then in the 1960s, there was understandably a major concern about just the financial burden of taking on such properties. But, for example, the OPW would have encountered a similar degree of caution in the state's attitude towards taking on the restoration of Kilmainham Jail. And Kilmainham Jail, of course, has a very different history. And looked up the Irish Times report on the official opening of Derrynane House, which is almost exactly 52 years ago today, on the Sunday the 20th of August in 1967. And that report suggests that there was nothing but positivity by those involved. President Eamon de Valera was here and gave, I believe, a fantastic speech. And even Jerry Collins last night said to me, "Maurice, you must get your hands on the text of that speech," because he felt it was a seminal moment in re-establishing that proud link to Daniel O'Connell. So we must, and I'm sure it's possible to get the exact text, but certainly the reports in the paper were very, very positive. Liam Cosgrave was there, and it mentioned, by the way, that the OPW had spent the princely sum of £12,000 between 1963 and 1967 on the restoration works here at Derrynane, and the phrase "tip of the iceberg" comes to mind, but again, I'm not going to go there. But it was lovely. By the way, I also saw that for that opening, there were some 30 members of the Curragh training band who were to come down for the opening, and they had a narrow escape. They escaped serious injury on the way to Derrynane when their bus slid off the road in overtaking a car about a mile away. And fell 6 feet into a field. So if you're disappointed we didn't have a brass band to greet you this morning, that's why we'd have loved to do it. But anyway, enough from me coming between you and a packed agenda of great material and an important event we want to get to now. Could I just thank, though, Chris O'Neill and Adrian Corcoran and all of my OPW colleagues working here at Derrynane. They do, I can assure you, and I think you know it as well as I do, they take huge pride and interest in the work, and it goes well beyond the call of duty, and you might just agree to a boulabus, I think, for them all. And I just also want to thank the local community here in Caherdaniel and the area who have been and are great supporters of Derrynane and take great pride, obviously, in the associations and all the activities here. Without local support, there's no way that we would have been able to achieve the Green Flag Award for the fourth time this year. We run events like the Discover Derrynane weekend each year, or one-off events like the recent Heart of Summer poetry and music event that some of you might have been here, run by Poetry, or organised by Poetry Ireland and moderated by none other than the aforementioned Olivia O'Leary. And thanks, of course, to the organisers, to Mary O'Connor and to Maurice Rick for setting up the school and running it this year and every year, and all of the committee involved. It's super, and as I say, we're so proud of the association. And it is Heritage Week, which I think is important, and you might hear a word about that again in a moment. And tomorrow is Heritage Sunday, so if any of you are staying over, the house will be open to the public free of charge tomorrow for Heritage Sunday, as we tend to do. So these are important events, and I want to wish everybody well for the day at the O'Connell School. So, thank you very much. Now.
The special event, by the way, is the presentation of O'Connell's death mask, which has been treasured and cared for over nearly 150 years by the Dunraven family. So I'd like to invite now the Countess of Dunraven to make the presentation to the Office of Public Works, which will accept it on behalf of the state, after which Lady Geraldine will say a few words. Thank you.
Slow. I've got a broken hip and a broken leg. I apologise. Today being... Yes, but I want to give you a present. Today being Heritage Week and tomorrow being the open day, this is a special present which we have guarded for 161 years in Derrynane Cottage, given to our family by, we assume, a member of the O'Connell family. So I want to particularly say thank you to Daniel and his wife for being here, because they are the present-day members of the O'Connell family. So I'd like you to give them a special Don't be terrified. Now, my friends, this is your friend, Daniel O'Connell. And Thady and I have loved it for all our lives. Thady vanished. Anna and I made the decision to give it to you and me, the nation, and to the jurisdiction of the Office of Public Works to guard it for you and me, the nation. So we have enormous pleasure in handing it to Mr. Buckley, who's the head of the Office of Public Works. And now the little small formality. This is a note written by us and goes with the bust as the formal handover. The Dunraven family of Derrynane Cottage have been in possession of this death mask of the great liberator Daniel O'Connell for the past 161 years. We have been proud to be the possessor of such an item. We have decided to return the mask to its rightful home at Derrynane House, the historical home of the O'Connell family in this Heritage Week 2019. This is now signed by me as a formal document and by my daughter, Lady Anna Johnson. That's the formality. And that hopefully will sit maybe with the mask at whatever. It has a very small damage to it on Daniel's nose and a little bit here, which is why we actually removed it from the cottage, because there are lots of small children and small feet and small inquisitive hands. Nice to see you too. So it goes now into all our jurisdictions.
We get a bit of polyfill.
That would terrify me.
Don't worry.
But I'd also like to say thank you to the people who have been thanked before. Thank you, Chris, for your friendship and for our meetings, etc. Thank you, Olivia O'Leary, for that wonderful programme on Daniel. Some people agreed with it, some people didn't agree with it. I thought it was absolutely fascinating and look forward to next Thursday. And thank you finally to meet the Office of Public Works head boss. Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. I can't switch them. Why not? Or you just freeze frame. Whatever. Anyone is, yeah. Snapshot. Yeah.
I find it better, yeah,
Okay, that, as I said this morning, was an addition to our programme, but I think you'd appreciate that it was a historic and extraordinary addition to our programme and was well worth including in it. It means, of course, they're running slightly behind, but someone else is new. So let me at this stage introduce Dr. Ruth Barrington, who's a member of our committee, who will introduce the first session to you. Thank you very much.
Maurice, thank you very much. Wasn't that a wonderful occasion? Just tremendous, and such generosity, Geraldine. You and your family, just wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we have to return to the theme of the summer school and continue our exploration of Daniel O'Connell's legacy, his influence in his own time, his influence at home, his influence abroad, and his influence in our time. And this session this morning, we have three excellent speakers, Professor Fergus Darcy, Jacqueline de Bredon, and Professor Cormac O'Grada, who are going to talk about three areas of O'Connell's activity that may be slightly controversial. Those of you that have been following the letters in the Irish Times will know about O'Connell's, well, the suggestion that O'Connell really wasn't very sympathetic to the labour movement and was anti-worker. So Professor Fergus Darcy is going to discuss that topic. Jacqueline is going to look at that other issue that there is criticism of O'Connell about, and that is his attitude to the Irish language. And then Cormac O'Grada is going to look at the impact of the Great Famine on Kenmare. And as we know, it was a matter of great despair for O'Connell, the outbreak of the famine, and he was coming to the end of his career, and he made valiant efforts to get government to intervene, to take action to prevent the worst impact. But as we know, his influence was limited at that stage. So our first speaker is Professor Fergus Darcy, who will talk about O'Connell and the workers of Dublin, 1820 to 1840. And Fergus is Professor Emeritus of History at UCD, where he was also the Dean of Arts. And he has written on a number of very interesting topics. He wrote an award-winning book on remembering the war dead, British Commonwealth and international war graves in Ireland since 1914. So I'm going to hand over now to Fergus to explore O'Connell's relationship with the labour movement.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and I want to thank Maurice and Mary and the rest of the committee for the invitation to be here and to share a few thoughts with you on this particular subject. And I'd like to take this occasion to call to mind with great fondness another great Kerry man, a great O'Connell scholar and a good friend whom we lost recently, and that was Jerry Lyne. Anybody who knew Jerry knew that he was totally devoted to his work, and those of us who ever wanted to study the life of O'Connell in more detail owe Jerry a very great debt for his openness and his helpfulness at all times. And I think very few people in Ireland would know as much as Jerry did about the very controversial life of Daniel O'Connell, a life of struggle and protest, of campaigns and controversy. And I think Jerry himself wouldn't dissent from a view, I hope not anyway, that if ever there was a conflict with personal and political recriminations, was there ever one as bitter as that between Dan and the Young Irelanders between 1845 and 1847? And my answer to that question is yes, there was. And that venomous episode was preceded by one just as bitter and just as explosive over the winter of 1837-8 as that which occurred with the Young Irelanders. And I refer, of course, to the relationship between Dan and the workers, the organised workers of Dublin. And this volcanic eruption took place over 3 sessions: on Stephen's Day of 1837, on the 8th of January 1838, and on the 30th of January 1838. And on these 3 occasions, in a meeting that was resumed, that was adjourned and then was adjourned again because it was so tempestuous, Dan met the organised workers of Dublin in what were extremely stormy public debates over workers' rights versus the public peace. And the debate of the 8th of January in particular raged over 5 furious hours in which O'Connell's personal safety was in extreme jeopardy. He was lucky to emerge, if not badly injured, even with his life. Now, the rumblings of this advancing storm had already been heard loud 2 months before that, when on the 6th of November 1837, Dan launched a blistering attack on the trade unions of Dublin for their having destroyed the trade of the city by their restrictive practices and by their bloody violence. He pointed the finger at their draconian enforcement of a minimum wage, of a restriction of apprentices, and of compulsory membership of their organisations. But above all else, he attacked their recourse to violence as they strove to hold the line against economic collapse. They returned the attack with equal vigour over his failure to continue to pursue the campaign for the repeal of the Act of the Union. And as they had it, they attacked him for his hypocrisy in condemning their restrictive practices, when he himself, as they saw it, belonged to a trade, the legal profession, where restricted practice was as much in evidence as it was among the ordinary workers of Dublin or Ireland. Now, the background to this conflict is a fairly complex one, with the twin elements of economic and political factors obtaining. As regards the economic dimension, from 1816 to 1850, thereabouts, that period was a disastrous one for many trades in Dublin, as indeed it was for the country at large. And post-war economic depression at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, combined with the increasing competition of mechanised industry in Britain, combined with the integration of the 2 economies in the middle of the 1820s with the abolition of the Irish currency, combined with the loss of the native parliament, which had given so much employment to various luxury trades and other trades, all of these things came together with huge force within 10 years of the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and combined to make the workers feel that their lot was a terrible one. By the mid-1820s, trade after trade felt these pressures, and skilled labour, particularly in Dublin, which was well organised, sought to fight back. By 1820, there were over 20 organisations of skilled workers by then long in existence. and by 1850 that number had risen from 20 to over 45. And they fought back so strongly against what was happening to them that they acquired, in Dublin in particular, but perhaps also in Cork and Limerick, they acquired a reputation for vigour and for violence that was unmatched in the entire United Kingdom. And they did this at a time when those original and great historians of the labour movement in Britain, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, when they did this at a time which the Webbs described as the revolutionary period of trade unionism. And we might well feel that the Irish and the Dublin dimension of that was more revolutionary than most. We might feel that. Now, in that context, it was hardly surprising that an element of violence entered the picture. And sometimes that violence was a spontaneous response of individual trade union members to desperate circumstances. But in a certain number of cases, the violence was planned and was actually a deliberate instrument of union policy. In the case of the Dublin Sawyers, in the case of the Dublin Carpenters, they had actually, as indeed the Molly Maguires in America in the 1870s, they actually decided that violence was the way. Now, whereas over the period roughly 1780 to 1816, organised workers and their employers had actually managed to achieve well-negotiated wage agreements. After 1816, those wage agreements fell apart and they were not renewed. And what happened was that a free-for-all ensued. And in that free-for-all, some unions resorted to brutal assaults in efforts to hold the line against wage reductions and against the wholesale employment of children as in the guise of apprentices. And it was such attacks on employers and on fellow workers from 1825 to 1838 that brought Daniel O'Connell himself directly into personal contact with the workers for the first time, when he acted as defence counsel in a number of notorious cases. The two most notorious, one in 1825, when he tried to get an acquittal for 6 men who were accused of attempted murder of a Dublin clothier named James Butterworth, who had introduced sophisticated machinery into his works, which was going to cause them unemployment. 1825, he failed on that occasion. 6 of them were sentenced to death, managed to be commuted for transportation for life. They were placed in the hulk in the River Liffey while they were waiting transportation. And one of them tried to escape and was subsequently shot dead. And then in 1830, he was defence counsel again, and perhaps was the most notorious labour conspiracy in the entire 19th century, revolving around the murder of a working sawyer named Thomas Hanlon. Now, these difficulties actually intensified over the 1830s, especially coming to a peak over 1836, 1837, as I say, the violence reached its peak. And what we have here, it's probably hard to see it enough, but this is an index of the price of a £4 loaf on the Dublin market, the price of bread, the basic commodity, between 1816 and 1850. The peaks there come the huge peak at the beginning in 1816, followed by peaks in the mid-20s and peaks in the mid-30s, correspond exactly with the times when the violence was at its greatest. So bad was the violence in 1837, it spread not just to individual employers and individual workers, but actually led to attacks on, it was combined with bread riots, and leading to attacks on baker shops, attacks on bread carts going through the city that required police escorts to ensure their safety. And it was against this background that organised labour looked back supposedly to the supposedly happy times of Grattan's Parliament, to the golden age of 1780 to 1800, when there was plenty of work and plenty of money. That basically was the bare bone outline of the economic background of what we're talking about today. With regard to the political background, it was very quickly after O'Connell's achievement of the triumph of Catholic emancipation that he began his campaign to try to bring back an independent Irish Parliament by seeking a repeal of the Act of Union of 1800. Emancipation achieved in 1829. He first raises the banner of repeal in January of 1830. He loses no time. And the workers simply flocked to that banner because they saw in repeal a return to prosperity. That was what it meant to them. And in fact, the Dublin workers, and workers all over Ireland, I think, responded with such enthusiasm to O'Connell's raising the banner of repeal of the Act of Union of 1830. They supported him with such persistence and such zeal that their support actually at times became an embarrassment to him, at times when he needed to be perhaps more flexible in his approach. And during the period August 1830 to August 1831, over 30 separate trades held public meetings in agitation for repeal of the Act of Union. And then, in August of 1831, this came to a climax with the foundation of a body which came eventually to be known as the National Trades Political Union. And the National Trades Political Union was conceived by working men as an independent forum where they could press for repeal. An independent strategy which actually O'Connell didn't like, because at times he saw it as a threat to his own freedom of action and a threat even to his own leadership. Labour's zealous commitment to the cause of repeal soon, as I say, came to embarrass O'Connell, because his own commitment to repeal, genuine though it was, had to be tempered by the realities of Westminster politics, which is something the workers didn't appreciate. And even if he had been very ardent in his pursuit of repeal over August 30 to August 31, by the late autumn of 1831, he realised that the movement for reform of the House of Commons, the movement for electoral reform, was going nowhere. The Great Reform Act, which eventually came in 1832, was actually defeated in one of its versions in October 1831, a major defeat, setback. And O'Connell came to the conclusion that his chances of getting repeal were zero in an unreformed House of Commons. So therefore he switched his strategy from seeking repeal to joining with British radicals and British advanced liberals in an attempt to secure reform of Parliament, and in the hope then that repeal might be a possibility. So that political development in Westminster forced him to recalibrate, as it were, his commitment to repeal. But this recalibration was something that went down very badly with the workers. And while he was trying to establish a position of strength with the British radicals over 1830 to 33, they continued to agitate for repeal. Now, he himself was very unhappy with this because he felt that by this stage that a premature presentation of a motion for a repeal of the Act of Union, if he presented this prematurely in the House of Commons, it could lead to a disastrous defeat. And this is exactly what happened when, in April 1834, his motion for repeal was rejected by the House of Commons by a massive 523 to 38 votes. All 38 votes being the votes of O'Connellite repealers, O'Connellite MPs, and a few advanced liberals in Ireland. Not a single English, Scottish, or Welsh MP voted for O'Connell's motion. Not a single one. There is a view of an exception. There was one man, John Kennedy of Tiverton, the MP for Tiverton, who actually voted for the motion, but he actually wasn't in favour of repeal. He just wanted an investigation into what the consequences of the Act of Union had been. So nobody except the Irish voted for repeal. Now, the trouble here by the middle of the 1830s is that the workers' disappointment at this coincides with the increase in the price of provisions. And here in the mid-30s, here in the mid-30s, we have a number of peaks, the worst one coming in 1837. And already in 1833, during one of those peaks of high tension and high labour violence, the climate in Dublin City was so bad in 1833 that the Lord Mayor called a public meeting under pressure from 120 of the leading Dublin employers to see if something could be done to quell labour agitation. And the meeting which he called in the middle of December 1833 went very, very badly for the employers, because it was a public meeting, an open meeting, and the workers simply flooded it and they took over the meeting. Dan was present at it, and interestingly enough, it appears that he didn't particularly want to be seen to take sides too strongly, one side or the other, in December 1833. But he did offer a few remarks that seemed to be in defence of the workers, or in understanding of the workers' anger and the workers' plight. And that caused absolute outrage to the employers in December 33. So much so that a newspaper editorial of the day following the meeting remarked, "The meeting of yesterday is one of the greatest, most formidable victories which the workers have yet obtained." Now, this would prove the last occasion on which Dan would be on the side of the workers in a public meeting. And fearing the independence of the workers, at this stage he had actually seen to the emasculation of the National Trades Political Union by flooding it with non-working members, opening it to non-working members, so that it became, in effect, a mouthpiece for O'Connell rather than a mouthpiece for the workers. And this was happening at the very time, 1834-35, when he was moving towards an alliance with the Whig Liberals in what was famously known as the Lichfield House Compact, where the Liberals were, or the Whigs more properly perhaps, were promising him that if he gave the support to them to oust Robert Peel and the Tories, that if he gave support for that, because he had a sizable number of MPs in the House, the largest single block of MPs other than Tories and Whigs, was Dan O'Connell's Irish Party. And that if he were prepared to support them in trying to oust Robert Peel, that they in turn would see that there was justice done to Ireland in a series of reforms for which he and everybody, and many other people in Ireland, were campaigning. But the Whig alliance, the so-called O'Connell-Whig alliance, while it did something in terms of justice for Ireland, getting a partial solution to the tithe problem, a partial solution to the monopoly of the Church of Ireland on revenues, and other areas, municipal reform, for example, in the end, although it did achieve a number of practical gains, it seemed to do nothing for the cause of repeal on which the workers had pinned their hopes. And now came the resurgence of labour violence, peaking in 1836-7. And we have here a little table. It may be hard to see it, but we're talking about 39 major labour assaults that led to convictions in 1836, rising to 97 in 1837. This huge increase in labour violence led to the crisis between O'Connell and the workers. And that crisis was to lead to a very severe breach between them. In that breach, he, as I say, accused the workers of having destroyed the trade of the city, and they in turn accused him of having reneged on repeal. He had let them down, and they were not going to forgive it. In that context, I have to say that the battle which now ensued over those three public meetings was one which was probably unequalled in the annals of personal mutual recrimination. And slurs and insults were slung between them. He accused them of engaging in conspiracies that were totally immoral, and they accused him of not having done anything and to help the cause of repeal in the end. And when he rounded on them and said that in fact they were showing scant respect for him and they were showing deep ingratitude, after all he had achieved Catholic emancipation, their reply to that was somewhat jaundiced, shall we say, when they said, what advantage is it to the tradesmen of Ireland that 1,300 situations have been opened in government offices as a result of emancipation? Has it given a loaf of bread to any of the 1,000 starving families of the poor of this city? No, it had not. Well, the meetings ending on the 30th of January 1838 at least didn't end in mutual personal assaults, physical assaults, and in a way after the 30th of January the poison between them began to drain away. It was as though these three meetings had lanced a boil. And the effect of that was that the animosity between them kind of didn't evaporate, but it diluted greatly. And that decline in animosity actually coincided with the dilution of his own alliance with the Whigs. By the end of the 1830s, he was coming to the conclusion that the Whig alliance was paying minimal dividends in the end, and his gaze began to return to the possibilities of a repeal agitation. And once he decided to launch the campaign for repeal as he did on the 14th of April 1840, everything was forgiven. The workers came flocking back to his banner. And that flocking back to his banner continued until his death and beyond it. A bond of attachment was, as it were, re-established between them, which in fact never seems to have disappeared thereafter. They turned up in their thousands in 1864 to mark the laying of the foundation stone for O'Connell on O'Connell Street, and they turned out in their tens of thousands this is the famous, there we are. They turned out in their tens of thousands in 1875 to mark the centenary of O'Connell's birth. Now, one of the interesting things about the draining of the poison, as it were, after 1837-8 is that there was a remarkable decline in labour violence. From 97 incidents in the city, close on 100 incidents in 1838, it went down to 2 in 1839, went up a little bit to 12 in 1839, and then down to 2 in 1840, and 0 after that. There's not a single case of labour violence in Dublin that is reported to the police between 1841 and 1911. 0. And this obviously raises the question of, had O'Connell some influence in moving the workers away from violence? Well, it's either a coincidence or a cause that immediately after those three meetings the labour violence goes down and then evaporates. Excuse me. And the Freeman's Journal was to comment on this in 1841 when it said, everyone condemned the violence of former periods, but the artisans of Ireland have now become temperate, and with temperance comes reflection. And they appeal not to the bludgeon and the knobstick, but to public opinion and the press, and they resort now to the use of reason only in their differences with their employers. Now, this is editorial wishing, perhaps, but it actually turns out also to be the reality. And as if to confirm it, in the very following year, when the bakers began their very, very decades-long campaign to abolish extensive night hours in the baking industry, a major dispute starting in 1841. In 1842, sorry, they actually say that we have learned from O'Connell. We have learned from O'Connell to abandon violence and to resort only to the use of argument with our employers. We have learned a lesson from O'Connell, they said. And we think with that great man that there is no social or political advantage that cannot be acquired by means of moral force and the irresistible influence of public opinion. Now, this isn't a one-off. Labour organisation after labour organisation in the 1840s come out and they say the very same thing. Even the hardest of them, the sawyers and the shipwrights and the carpenters, they all come out and they say, we have learned from O'Connell that the way forward is negotiation, is reason, not violence. Then the carpenters in particular made up their quarrel with Dan to such an extent that on a famous occasion he came out and he said in his charming Hibernian manner, he says, if the carpenters and I have had a difference of opinion in which we both respected the integrity of each other, here we are today, joined hand and heart together. And as I say, his death in 47 didn't change that apparent attachment. So, to come now to a conclusion and to offer just a few very quick reflections, because I know we're tight on time, it has been suggested that, I would suggest that behind the conflict over labour organisation and labour violence, that there was actually a deep philosophical gulf between O'Connell and the workers, which was never actually bridged. I think they papered over it. Because I would argue that for all his nationalism, O'Connell was, I think anyway, profoundly in the mindset of laissez-faire liberalism, that he was profoundly in his attitudes illiberal, whereas I think the workers were profoundly, with a small c of course, profoundly conservative. Now this brings me to a consideration of people who are not very much in vogue these days. I refer to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But writing in 1848, maybe they got a lot of things wrong, but sometimes their historical analysis can be acute. It can be really incisive. And in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, Marx and Engels were to write, the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all of these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore, this is the workers, they are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay, they are more, they are reactionary because they try to roll back the wheels of history. And I would say that this is exactly what the Labour in Dublin was doing between 1816 and 1850. They were trying to roll back the wheels of history to Grattan's Parliament. And I want to end by reference to another great son of Kerry and another great O'Connell historian, because if the workers had not put on rose-tinted glasses to look at the past of 1780 to 1800, they might have understood much more correctly that the Irish bourgeoisie and the Irish aristocracy of 1780 to 1800 were only too happy to use the workers to try to get support and pressure for an independent Irish Parliament. But once they got it, they moved very quickly to suppress the workers and pass some of the most draconian anti-labour legislation that is to be found on the statute books between 1780 and 1800. And the original source for this, or the best source for this, is in fact that other great Kerry man and Kerry historian, O'Connellite historian, Maurice O'Connell, because it was Maurice's article, a pioneering article of 1963, called Class Conflict in a Pre-Industrial Society, which actually drew attention to this very fact. Thank you.
thank you very much indeed, Fergus, for a really excellent overview of O'Connell's relationship, the complex relationship he had with the workers of Dublin, and that long historical perspective you presented. Really fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Now, because we're running short of time, we're going to keep going. Won't we keep the questions to the end if we have some time? So I'm going to introduce our next speaker to you, and that is Jacqueline de Bredon, who is going to speak about Daniel O'Connell and the Irish language. Jacqueline he's an award-winning journalist. He's worked with the Irish Times. He was Northern editor with the Irish Times for a while. He was foreign affairs correspondent and political correspondent. And he's written a number of books, including Power Play, The Rise of Sinn Féin. And I can say I'm a colleague of his on the Press Council and very much enjoy his company in that particular responsibility. So Jacqueline, over to you.
Let me issue a health warning at the start. I'm a journalist, I'm not an academic. I was almost became an academic, but I had a lucky escape and became a journalist. So I may make some howlers here. I have this nightmare of someone in the audience coming up to me in the end and saying, possibly in a Donegal accent, that was very interesting, but the name of the man you're talking about is Daniel O'Connell, not Daniel O'Donnell. So in my long lost youth, I was engaged in a research project about the decline of the Irish language, and in the process, I wrote an article for a bilingual Conradh na Gaeilge magazine called Rusk, which appeared in 1978 when I was 3 months old. And I'm drawing on that, and also I've updated it to a considerable extent, I believe. I may be quoting from O'Connell, so I just wanted to try and get the accent right, and I came across a book called Ireland by a German called J.G. Cole, from that period, O'Connell's life, and he writes, he described a visit to a repeal meeting in Dublin, which was addressed by the Liberator, and he said, "I was surprised to find that he spoke with so strong an Irish accent or brogue. Not that he talked of repeal like Tom Steele and many others who were present, but still I was struck by many peculiarities of dialect which I should feel it difficult to describe." So there you are. He didn't have a posh accent. Tom Steele was an interesting character, Protestant from Clare, who actually became very involved in the repeal campaign and even was one of the nominees for O'Connell's famous election in Clare. So what was Daniel O'Connell's attitude to the Irish language? His only recorded statement in this regard is, to my knowledge, the one quoted by William O'Neill Daunt, who was a repeal MP from Mallow, in his book Personal Recollections of the Late Daniel O'Connell MP, published in 1848, and this was, of course, after O'Connell's death, and the incident or the episode he describes happened 15 years before. So he says, on St. Patrick's Day 1833, I met Mr. O'Connell at dinner at the house of Sir Edward, then Mr. Bulwer. Someone asked him whether the use of the Irish language was diminishing among our peasantry. Yes, he answered, and I am sufficiently utilitarian not to regret its gradual abandonment. A diversity of tongues is no benefit. It was first imposed on mankind as a curse at the building of Babel. It would be a vast advantage to mankind if all the inhabitants of the earth spoke the same language. Therefore, although the Irish language is connected with many recollections that twine around the hearts of Irishmen, yet the superior utility of the English tongue as the medium of all modern communications is so great that I can witness without a sigh the gradual disuse of the Irish. And O'Neill Daunt continues, he said that in 1828 he had made a speech in Irish at a Catholic meeting in the County Louth, and that at some other place, Tralee, if I recollect aright, the reporters from a London journal were ludicrously puzzled as at an harangue he delivered in the ancient tongue of Éireann. So I checked out the Meath newspapers. The Drogheda Journal, the front page was a little different from the present day organs, but plenty of content. And anyway, and Saturday, published on Saturday, July 19th, 1828, it describes a meeting earlier in the week. And it says, on Monday at 3 o'clock, Mr. O'Connell proceeded from Mr. Markey's of Walshestown for Dundalk to preside at the Louth Club dinner. A vast crowd were assembled outside Mr. Markey's, who loudly cheered Mr. O'Connell's appearance, Mr. O'C's appearance, it says, and followed his carriage. Mr. O'Connell, unwilling to bring them on foot further, stopped at the termination of about 2 miles, and in a speech, mostly in Irish, he addressed them. He recommended obedience to the law, respect to religion, and abstinence from all secret societies. So that is an interesting occasion. That's the occasion that he clearly is referring to in the O'Neill book. The 1851 census informs us that County Louth was 20.7% Irish speaking. Now, what's interesting about it is that O'Connell would clearly have spoken the Munster dialect, and County Louth, I don't know what. I mean, I know now that the County Louth version of English is a bit different from the wonderful tones of Kerry English. So, but he clearly made himself understood, and I get the feeling no matter what he said, he would have been cheered to the echo. There was another occasion, the other occasion to which O'Connell refers, where in Tralee he recollects. There's a description in William Fagan's The Life and Times of Daniel O'Connell, published in Cork, 1847-48. It goes as follows. But the best thing he ever did, by means of his proficiency in the vernacular, was during the repeal agitation in 1833, when the government first began to send reporters to the meetings in the provinces. So they weren't real journalists; they were agents, actually, and I think openly displayed as such, in order to watch the proceedings with the view to prosecutions. The first debut of the government reporters was at a meeting, if we recollect rightly, at Kanturk. The gentlemen were English and belonged to Mr. Gurney's reporting staff. They came on the platform and introduced themselves to Mr. O'Connell. He shook them by the hands and said to those about him, nothing can be done here until these gentlemen are afforded every requisite accommodation. I should have got a Kerryman to read this bit. This was at once provided, and having assured Mr. O'Connell that they were perfectly ready and well provided for, he came forward to address the people and commenced his speech listen to this, to the great dismay of the Cockneys, capital C, in the Irish language, in italics. Having explained to the assembly who they were and how he humbugged them, he continued in the same language to address to the meeting everything he wished to convey to them. The people laughing all the while at the English reporters, while they joined very good-naturedly in the laugh raised against them. And indeed, Charles Gavin Duffy, in his book Young Ireland, he refers to an occasion which I think was another occasion actually, which appears to, from the context, appears to have been in 1843, where he talks about it was understood that official agents, this was when the repeal meetings were going on as well, it was understood that official agents began to make their appearance. Government shorthand writers sent with the manifest purpose of providing evidence in case of a prosecution. The rumour created great indignation, and this feeling was likely to have exhibited itself in an uncivil reception of the officials. If O'Connell's good humour and good sense had not satisfied the popular feeling by turning the laugh against them. At Skibbereen, he insisted that they should be treated with the utmost courtesy, and when they were duly seated and had their notebooks and pencils in hand, he advanced to the front of the platform and began to address the people in Irish, ! So he had a grasp, a good knowledge of Irish, and as we know, a bit of a sense of humour as well. So the Kanturk and Tralee areas were predominantly Irish-speaking in O'Connell's time. The 1851 census figure for County Cork was 52.5%. The County Kerry figure, 31% and 41.4%. So anyway, Fagan tells us of two other occasions, this is interesting, where O'Connell addressed public meetings in Irish, both of them at Tralee. And he writes, it was during this 1835 election in Kerry that his perfect knowledge of the Irish language was displayed on a remarkable occasion. He was in Tralee at his hotel. The main street was filled by a dense mass waiting to hear him. He presented himself at one of the windows and spoke to them in Irish. It was said to have been the most eloquent speech he ever delivered. The topics were of the exciting kind. The recent slaughter at the Red Field of Gortrow was in itself a subject of painful interest, and when described in the expressive language of the country, had a powerful effect on the feelings. When he described the widow Ryan of Gortrow searching amidst the dead for her own darling son, how the son smiled upon her in death, how she knelt down and kissed his cold gore. When he spoke in this strain in the Irish language to an Irish crowd, it can easily be imagined the effect he produced. And the Gortrow massacre was, as you know, in those days, it was part of the tithe war, where everyone was expected to pay tithes to the established church, and there was a refusal to pay tithes, and the British Army was sent in to protect an enforced collection of tithes. And the widow Ryan was, I think, owed 40 shillings, if I'm not mistaken. But it ended up with about 20 locals being killed. So Fagan goes on. In Tralee, he again, during another election in 1837, as he did on a former occasion, make his knowledge of the Irish language serviceable to the cause. Quote, the author quotes a description, all that he has even said of eloquence at the bar, in the Senate, I presume that Senate is being used in a general sense with regard to Parliament, or at the popular meetings, writes a friend informing us of the incident, was as nothing in its effect on the feelings, passions, and judgment of his audience, when compared with the Prospero spell. You Shakespearean scholars will know about Prospero and his spell, which he flung around him as the rich southern patois rolled off his tongue, now deep with pathetic emotion, anon curdling the blood as he burst forth into that withering denunciation of which he was such a master, and to which the character of the Irish language is so calculated to give intensity, while it may be in the midst of some impassioned stroke of the wizard's wand, he would turn round and set the throbbing multitude laughing as he told them, quote, how he bothered the reporters, unquote. and the informant writes, "Ignorant though I was of the language, it was impossible not to know the passions upon which he played." And again, satirical magazine, The Miletian, a pro-British government, wrote in February 16 that the great Catholic Demosthenes, in his impeachment of the Duke of Richmond, lamented that he was restricted in his eloquence by the ignorance of his auditory, his audience, of the Irish language. Interestingly, while the Irish language movement in general has been very critical of O'Connell, Skellig, J.J. O'Kelly, who came from Valentia Island, this proves that all politics is local, he was president of the Gaelic League, very traditional Republican, and he wrote in his biography, O'Connell Calling, published in Tralee in 1947, in defence of O'Connell. He said, "On the year of O'Connell's death, we find himself and Smith O'Brien vice presidents of the Celtic Society, which published O'Donovan's edition of Leabhar na Geart, and may be said to have pioneered the Gaelic revival. For 20 years, he was the bosom friend of Dr. McHale, that's the famous Archbishop of Tuam. Could these things have happened had he been an enemy of Irish? In Derrynane, he generally used Irish, except in speaking to visitors ignorant of it. There too, the family prayers were always in Irish, and we have it on the authority of his chaplain that in his last pilgrimage, Irish was his language of prayer to the moment of his death. And indeed, 4 years after his death, the 1851 census informs us that his native barony of Ivera, I hope I got that right, Ivrach, was 89.5% Irish speaking. And O'Connell himself was fostered by one of his father's farm workers. And we're told that when he returned to his parents at the age of 4, the first conversations with them were in Irish. There's an interesting story here, if I can find it, if you just bear with me. Yes, he was, as you know, he was fostered by an Irish-speaking couple, and his only tongue was the Irish language, and in fact he thought that the herdsman and his wife were actually his parents. And when on a visit, I hope I got to pronounce it, it's spelled Carhen, but I believe it's pronounced Carn, is that right? Carn. Corn. When on a visit to Carn, his father asked him, O'Connell's father asked him, in Irish of course, if he had ever eaten mutton before. And O'Connell answered, "Yes, my father brought in one of Morgan O'Connell's sheep and killed it." Morgan was his father, I believe. And then, so Hunting Cap, his uncle, and Morgan, his father, I hope I got that right, they dropped the O from O'Connell because, you know, it wasn't a good period in history to have an O in front of your name. But Irish was their working language, with servants, labourers and tenants, but among themselves they spoke and wrote in English only. Yeah, okay. And one of the joys of researching this was I discovered that O'Connell's aunt, I believe it was the woman who came out with the famous Lament for Art O'Leary when her husband was murdered for refusing to sell his horse to someone from the established church. And so, without going on too long, there's a dispute as to whether Mary, his wife, spoke Irish or not. one of the commentators says she lived all her life before marriage in a middle-sized town, Tralee, and though the chances may have been against it, a child could certainly have grown up monolingually English-speaking in such a place in the last 2 decades of the 18th century. So I don't know what the Gaelgori in Tralee would say, but O'Connell's the first language learned by O'Connell's sons was Irish, and there's another good yarn where I think I'll finish on this note. Where it says, the infant O'Connell was sent to the wife of his father's herdsman who lived in a cabin on the Iveragh Mountains. He had passed his 3rd year when he was brought back again to Carn. Just before he left the dwelling of the herdsman, a wedding took place there. It was attended by a crowd of the neighbours with the usual drinking and merrymaking. That's shocking. He returned to Carn, a precocious and observant child, and noticing how frequently parties assembled under its hospitable roof for dinner or a dance, he asked his mother in Irish, "Is there a wedding here every night?" So there you are. Anyway, he wasn't ideologically supportive of the Irish language, but he was very willing to use it on occasions where it suited him. And in fact, when he died, as I think I've said already, when he was dying, he was praying in Irish, and someone commented in the famous Irish language saying, he spoke Irish from birth to death, of Wish Gabos. Thank you.
Jacqueline, thank you so much for, I think, redeeming O'Connell's reputation in relation to the Irish language and for conveying to us some of the man's amazing sense of humour, obviously from a very early age. So thank you very much indeed. So now we're moving to a slightly more sober topic, which is the effect of the famine in Kenmare. And to talk about that, we're delighted to have Professor Cormac O'Bráda. Now, Cormac is Professor Emeritus of Economics at University College Dublin. His book on Ireland, A New Economic History, is considered a seminal work. He's researched in a number of areas, including Irish demographic, and published in a number of areas, including Irish demographic changes, the famine, and the socio-economic history of the Jews in Ireland. So my pleasure to invite Professor O'Bráda to speak about the impact of the famine in Kenmare.
Thanks a lot. It's Daslan Behan, so after listening to Daglon there, I'm tempted to speak in Irish. It might add to my eloquence, but I won't. I'm going to be talking about the famine in Kenmare and the Kenmare district, in a way about the Lansdowne estate. Daniel O'Connell doesn't get a mention in this talk. However, Daniel O'Connell and the famine are discussed in the second instalment of Olivia O'Leary's programme, which I think is being shown on Monday. So if you want to know more directly about O'Connell and the famine, that's the place to go. Now, the area we're talking about here was very, very poor, but that did not prevent population there from growing very, very rapidly before the famine. Between 1821 and the famine, the population of the Kenmare area rose by about a quarter. So it's at kind of breakneck speed almost. William Stewart Trench, who took over as agent on the Lansdowne estate in January 1850, claimed that the estate had been much neglected by his predecessor, James Hickson. And I believe he had a point. Archdeacon John O'Sullivan of Kenmare, who was on friendly terms with both Hickson and his employer nevertheless accused Hickson, here I'm quoting him, of seeking to accommodate everyone, and instead of clearing out, he gave patches of land to persons who were found upon the property. Although Hickson imposed clauses forbidding subdivision on leaseholders, he hardly ever enforced them. And partly in consequence of this kind of laissez-faire, kind of let-be policy, there were lots and lots of people on the estate wholly dependent on the potato. And of course, when the potato failed, they're in real dire straits. Now, the failure of the potato in that area in 1845 was much worse than in the country as a whole. And it caused widespread panic. On the 13th of November 1845, not 1846, and here I'm reading from one of the newspapers, over 3,000 persons with a marked appearance of affliction on the faces of each attended an open-air meeting at Ardea Crossroads, that's in Tuathist, to highlight their plight. The meeting was presided over by the local parish priest, Father Callahan McCarthy, whose minute inquiry, as he described it, suggested that 3/4 of the potato crop, which was their mainstay, had been lost. Now, disaster was to follow in the wake of the second failure of the potato. And although Kenmare and Tuathist never achieved the notoriety of, let's say, Kilrush or Skibbereen, nevertheless, the crisis in the Kenmare era was at least as bad as in Skibbereen, and it lasted longer. The worst was over in Skibbereen by late 1847. That is not true of the Kenmare area. And indeed, in January 1847, the Irish Examiner referred to Tuathist as a second Skibbereen. The local newspapers from that time on carried lots and lots of macabre stories about events in the area, until those stories lost their newsworthiness. And one could go on detailing some of these stories and be accused of famine porn. Nevertheless, I think it is necessary to know in detail and graphically what went on. So I'll give you a few examples and then move on. I know we're short of time. But according to Archdeacon O'Sullivan, who was an influential and very intelligent clergyman, in May 1847 there was nothing more usual than to find 4 or 5 bodies on the street of Kenmare every morning. They would remain so, and in their homes unburied, had we not employed 3 men to go and convey them to the graveyard. There were accounts of men selling turf for a pittance in Kenmare and dying of starvation on the way home, of a walking spectre carrying the doubled up remains of a sister to the graveyard, and of people in the month of February at the seashore up to their waists in water looking for miserable shellfish and seaweed to endeavour to support nature. But of course, seafood was no substitute for the potato. One account told of a woman dying of, and here I quote, some seaweed as if plucked off the rocks and no other food. Another of a man with a stone in his hand and 3 oysters broke, one of them empty when found. Dr. Maybury, who was the local medical officer, couldn't find a particle of food in the stomach. People died uncared for and uncoffined. The miserable funeral of 3 or 4 scarcely able to carry the remains of the deceased to the graveyard, now more like a tillage field. I find that very evocative. Where he who conveys the deceased today is often himself born the next day. So by early 1847, resignation and despair led the people to look on death as a blessing. When reprimanded by a corridor for leaving his dying wife outside a house in Kenmare, where he found lodging for the night, one Owen Sullivan mordantly replied, "Perhaps, your worship, you can tell me what better thing could happen her." So there's a lot of that. We don't know how many people died in the area. There are no precise death statistics. Although the situation, how bad the situation it was, is reflected in births in data on baptisms, because you get baptism plummet and baptisms, the level of baptism stays low after the famine. One official of the Board of Works officially described to assist, and this is in the early railway age, so it's a nice turn of phrase, being depopulated with railway speed. He reckoned that there were 3 deaths a day on a stretch of road in Two Assist where 300 were employed, while according to the local parish priest, around the same time, that's Callahan McCarthy, deaths in the parish averaged 5 a day, 5 or 6 times the pre-famine norm. 2 months later, the Kerry Evening Post reported that weekly deaths amounted to 100. Now, the story of the famine is often told in terms of relief, and one could proceed in that way in this context as well. And I'm not going to do so in any detail, but it is worthwhile pointing out that the workhouse in Kenmare opened late on the 25th of October 1845, so it was up and running in time for the famine, but it did not welcome inmates with open arms before the failure of the Predator, and the regime inside the walls was very harsh. So much so that in late June 1846, and this is at a time when the situation is already very serious, 42 paupers left the workhouse because the food was so bad there. Although the workhouse still contained only about 100 inmates in September 1846, the Board of Guardians had requested a loan of £500 to build a fever hospital, and the visitors' book, this is a very good source, noted the death of some inmates in the house from want. The visitors found the workhouse food inadequate and the milk bad, and again they refer to people leaving the workhouse in desperation in the very early stages of the famine. Now, one thing to remember here is that the workhouse is financed through local taxation. The situation is extremely grim, and the area does not have the taxable capacity in any realistic sense to keep the local population alive. So the Kenmare Workhouse and the Kenmare Union throughout the famine into the early 50s is financially strapped. And at one point, of course, the local guardians are dismissed and paid vice guardians are put in to replace them. But one really can't blame the guardians for the plight the workhouse was in, because in their first report, the new paid vice guardians deemed the news that 14 of the old ward had defaulted on their own poor rates as a measure of the lamentable prospects facing them. So the real problem for them was how were they going to raise the rates, the local taxes, in order to alleviate the situation. They describe in detail, this is when they take over, the shocking state of the workhouse. A matron who, for the want of a brush, was forced to sweep out her own room with rags, a medical officer dying of typhus fever, and a master who had originally been the workhouse porter, also suffering from typhus, and who was clearly unequal to the task. They reported that the great majority of the 328 inmates who had died in the previous year or so had been buried without a coffin, and I quote, carried to the graves in what is termed a slip coffin, so contrived that the bottom was made to slide out and then the body covered with the clay. No contract for coffins existing. Now, the situation in the workhouse continued in a very, very awful situation right throughout the famine. So there's a sense in which, instead of saving lives, the workhouse either caused people who arrived in there reasonably healthy to die, or more important, deterred a lot of people from using the facilities because they were afraid things would be worse. So there are lots of graphic accounts, not only of the workhouse itself, but during 1848 up to 1850 of other properties in the town that were taken on to relieve the pressure on the original workhouse. Because by 1849, 1850, the workhouse, which was at the beginning very reluctant to take people on, was catering for something like 3,000 people. And that is why you see here the population of Kenmare increases during the famine. It's simply because the workhouse is holding so many people. Whereas the population of Kilcaskin and Tuassist, neighbouring parishes, they drop, particularly the population of Tuassist, it drops from 7,500 to 4,000 over the famine decade. And I don't have time to go into the details, but you can see here comparing those parishes with Kerry as a whole and Ireland as a whole. So this is an area which is very badly affected. This here, again, these are the parish registers of Tuassist and Kenmare, and you can see there how baptisms fall off with the failure of the potato. This, by the way, is Lenny Chiquin. This is in the parish of Tuassist. Now, I just want to now make a kind of a fundamental point about this area, which I think has a broader resonance, and that is, once the potato failed in this area, there was no going back to the status quo ante. The population of Tuassist was never going to go back to 7,500. That was absolutely impossible. So what are you going to do with the people who are surplus to requirements? And there are two ways out, actually. One is they die, and the other is you maintain them. But you're going to end up maintaining them for a long, long time, unless, as Archdeacon O'Sullivan pointed out, unless the potato is restored to where it had its previous fertility and reliability, these areas will not be able to go back to where they were. So, if you don't want to cater for people indefinitely, what are you going to do? You're going to try and get them out. So emigration is the solution. The difficulty is that the people who are most in need of emigration, as it were, the very, very poorest, they cannot afford to emigrate. So you have, if you like, a kind of a hierarchy. There are some people who are not affected very much by the famine at all. There are then farmers who, they manage, they suffer because, they consume potatoes too, they use potatoes to feed pigs and so on, but they manage. And a lot of them actually, they have the money to emigrate. They can sell some stuff and go. But the very poor can't. Now, what happened in Tuassist and in Kenmare was that the local landlord, at the urging of Stuart Trench, decided to ship people out. And the other thing that Stuart Trench did, so it was partly that Lansdowne would pay for people, but he also got the local workhouse to borrow money from the Poor Law Commissioners to send out more people. So emigration from this area is of two kinds. It's of poor tenants being shifted out, but it's also of people being sent out from the workhouse. And in total, about 4,000 people are shipped out. The difficulty is that this started too late. The emigration scheme dates from 1850, and by that time, a lot of the people who should have been shipped out were already dead. But nevertheless, what happened here is very, very interesting for the following reason, and that is that we can document what happened to these emigrants with a good deal of detail and confidence when they reached, in particular, New York. They didn't all go to New York, but we have a lot of evidence on the emigrants who end up in New York, their passage having been paid either by the Poor Law Commissioners or by Lord Lansdowne. And the reason we know is that perhaps about a half of them, we can't be precise, opened accounts in the early 1850s in the Emigrant Savings Bank in New York, which had been founded in 1850 at the behest of the Archbishop of New York to help people acquire the saving habit, send money home to their families and so on. So this bank is up and running when these Tuo Sist people arrive. The point is, they arrive pretty much penniless. How they manage to get their act together so that sometimes within months, more often within a year or two, they are saving significant sums of money in the Emigrant Savings Bank is something that we would like to know more about. But we can, in the records of the Emigrant Savings Bank, it's a bit like today when you join a bank, you have a password and you might use your mother's surname or something like that, or your first motor car or your favourite football team. The Emigrant Savings Bank collected information on not only everybody's parents' names, but on where they came from down to townland level, how many of their siblings they left behind, how many of their siblings were in America, were their parents alive or dead, when did they arrive in America, what ship did they come on. And then you also have information on the first deposit they make in the bank and on all their savings activity in the bank until they close their account. So we also have their addresses in New York and what they do in New York. And this is, of course, something we have for thousands of Irish immigrants, but I'm just talking here about those from the Kenmare area. Now, when they arrive, the great majority of the Kenmare emigrants settle in the 6th Ward of New York, 6th Ward, which is the poorest. And it's pretty much like a no-go area. That is how, I'll skip this. That is how Charles Dickens describes it just before the Irish arrive. It's crime infested, every second house doubles up as a tenement and a brothel. There are lots of cheap pubs where there's fighting going on. Do they ever wonder why their masters walk up instead of going on all fours? So Dickens sees people in the 5 Points area in the 6th Ward as, in some sense, subhuman. So this is where these people live. And this is a house on Baxter Street. So in the 1850s, this is roughly the period we're talking about. And then you can see here in this early photograph, it's not really very different. In the first one, it's a scene of a coffin being brought out of the house. But we know that there are people from Tuo Sist and Kenmare living in this very house, and that they had accounts in the Emigrant Savings Bank. So there is this incongruity between the circumstances in which they lived and their effort to better themselves. We can also follow them through to some extent by looking at the New York census of 1855, the US census of 1861. We can trace, not all of them, but quite a lot. Most of them in 1861 are still living in the 6th Ward. And that is not true of Irish from other counties who settle in the 6th Ward. They are quicker to get out. It's also true that when we first encountered these people in the Emigrant Savings Bank ledgers and the books that signed them in, as it were, they described themselves as labourers. The overwhelming majority are labourers. When we look at them later, insofar as we can, most of them still are labourers. But there is some sign of upward mobility, particularly into trading. Some become more skilled, but for the most part, you have people who can become hucksters, innkeepers, fruiterers, and so on. Now, Tyler Anbinder, with whom I've worked on this material, he has gone into, if you like, cameos of individuals from that area, which I haven't. I rely on, I'm a kind of a quantitative historian, so I look at averages and so on. Tyler is a kind of a pure historian, so he's interested more in the human interest and the individuals. But he describes, for example, Daniel Harrington from Tuo Sist, who worked for decades in New York as a day labourer. Daniel Shea from Kilcascan and Daniel Sullivan from Tuo Sist, they did the same. But then you have Murty O'Sullivan, who's from Kenmare, who arrived in New York in February 1850, ahead of the main Lansdowne exodus. By 1858, he had opened a pub or a saloon in the Five Points. John Lane, also from Kenmare, moved from day labour to liquor sales. Taylor Jeremiah Sheehan, also from Kenmare, opened his own clothing shop, and that's recorded in 1870, while Peter Shea from Tuo Sist abandoned work as a longshoreman to become a grocer's. Now, sometimes those shifts could be fleeting, so you have somebody becoming a saloon keeper and he's back being a labourer 10 years later. But the point is that there is some evidence of adaptation and of progress. There are no get-rich-quick stories here. But the point is that emigration was a safety valve for these people. You know, had that not been available, they would have stayed in the workhouse, more of them would have died. The pity is that more people like these Shays and Sullivans hadn't been moved in 1848 and 1849. And, you know, I would make the more general point that famine relief was, the focus of famine relief by the government was on, you know, palliative relief in the workhouse or in the public works. That really wasn't working very well. It's not anachronistic to say that emigration was a better solution. There were people who pointed that out at the time. There were lots of people who made the case in Parliament. But the government, and in particular the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Will, was dead set against it, because he said helping some to go would lead others to try and free ride. You might, you know, not be able to target people properly. It would reduce initiative and so on. So we're talking here about a case study in a partial solution to a terrible problem that worked for these people from Tuo Sist. And can you only think, you know, had maybe $1 million or $2 million been spent on this kind of relief rather than the way in which it was spent, how much more efficient and effective it would have been. Now, I realize that this is a bit provocative because most people would see famine emigration as part of the famine tragedy, you know, and they would see people who were forced out as victims of the famine. That is certainly the common attitude in the United States. But you have to see that emigration, you know, is not only part of the tragedy, it's also part of the solution. It's a solution to a tragedy. And the pity is that it wasn't resorted to more. Now, I could go on and talk about this for another hour, but I know we're short of time. So I just end on a note that this is a policy that should have been tried and wasn't. And of course, it's a policy with a great deal of resonance to the 21st century. So I leave you there.
Cormac, thank you indeed for a very stimulating alternative view of the role of famine emigration and the role it played in improving the lives of people in this area, and no doubt bringing great talent and expertise in the long term to the United States. We are running late, but I think because the papers were so good, I'd love to take one or two questions, because I know there must be issues that you'd like to raise with them. Could I ask if there's anybody in the AV room or in the marquee who'd like to put a question first? Or maybe they're more interested in coffee and tea, but no? Okay. Is anybody here before we close?
Hello. One question from the AV room.
AV room, yes, please.
On the Irish language, you made it clear, or Mr. Brandon made it clear how rhetorically fluent in both English and Irish. O'Connell was, and no doubt he was fluent in French as well. As a schoolboy on the continent, he did classics, and I understand from a speaker a couple of years ago here, he came second in Greek in one of his classes. I wondered, I don't know how much evidence there is otherwise of direct statement against the Irish language, but it struck me that one would need to know maybe more about the context of the statement quoted at the beginning about how one would benefit greatly from having just one language and so on. It struck me that depending on who else was present, that could have been a sort of tongue-in-cheek or advocatus diaboli, or that one needn't necessarily take it as a pure O'Connell, depending on who else was there and whether he was taking the mickey out of some other person's views or something like that.
Well, thank you very much. We'll ask Jacqueline to give a quick response, please.
I'm glad you asked me that, because in the undelivered part of my oration, I said these remarks were made at the house of a prominent English novelist. I don't have the name. Before what must have been an almost exclusively English audience. And the Daunt, the source of the story, tells us the party consisted exclusively of anti-coercion members of the legislature. It is unlikely that O'Connell ever made such remarks before an Irish audience at a public meeting. At any rate, such sentiments would have jarred with the the general demagogically nationalist tone of his speeches, and would have gained him no political advantage. He himself speaks of the affection of the Irish for their native language.
Thank you. Paddy Bush, we have one question here. Yeah?
It's a related...
Could you wait for the microphone because they can't hear you outside?
It's a related question, really, and Daiglan did mention that Gluaiseach na Gaeilge in general was very condemnatory of O'Connell, but that same Gluaiseach na Gaeilge, shared the dominant ideology of violent nationalism. Now, O'Connell died in 1847, long before there was anything like a revival movement. The criticism levelled at him is not levelled at loads of other nationalist figures who showed no interest whatsoever in the Irish language. Is it really, and my own anecdotally rather than historically, I think people who make the accusation that it's really a way of attacking his non-violent nationalism by people who are offended by that?
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I suppose some of them would. But I imagine that, I need to check this out, but I imagine that Douglas Hyde and Creeveen even, who was a non-violent nationalist, would probably have been critical. I mean, there are different views, as I say. Skellig was very defensive of O'Connell, but by and large, he was a Kerryman, yes. Look after your own. So he wouldn't be chairing for Dublin next Sunday, but or tomorrow week. But yes, I think it was part of the drive to support the revolutionary, violent approach. And indeed, I've been thinking in the last few days, one of the reasons O'Connell's role in history was downplayed was because the government here, the independent government here, was established by violence, and the state that was founded was established in a war. So, harking back to a man who was in favour of a complete non-violent approach, accepting his language, would have been, what's the word, counterintuitive?
So thank you. Thank you for those questions, and just on your behalf, can I thank our three speakers for really three stimulating, fascinating papers, and for something, I think, raising issues that will be discussed over coffee and for a long time afterwards. Thank you very much indeed.